The opening shot of golf's civil war came in the form of a press release. Published on a Friday in late October of 2021, the newly formed company, Live Golf Investments, with the backing of the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, announced its commitment of $200 million to establish 10 new marquee professional golf tournaments. It also announced its new CEO, the brash Australian, the former world #1 golfer, the Shark, Greg Norman. And it announced, well, little else. Who would play, where they'd play, and exactly how these tournaments would be played were details for a later date. Instead, the release opted for platitudes and an ominous promise that this was only the beginning. For other established sports leagues, it might be easy to write off the arrival of such an overly vague and optimistic challenger. The established leagues have the money, they have the TV deals, and most importantly, they have the talent. The PGA Tour, the most prestigious golf circuit in the world, however, is a little different. While it has the money and TV deals, it doesn't pay for the luxury of keeping its talent locked down. Whereas most professional sports leagues pay their players consistent base salaries with the occasional incentive looped into a contract, the PGA Tour only pays for winning. For the world's very best, this works just fine. Show up to a third or maybe a half of the 40-something annual PGA tournaments, post a score good enough to land in the money or even win outright, bring home the winnings, and cash in on the media attention through endorsement deals. But this creates a problem for those in the middle and back of the pack. Elite golfers in their own right, but golfers who are paying for their own travel, coaching, and accommodations only to quite possibly finish outside the money if they don't play to their full potential. All this is to say, the PGA Tour and its pay structure, along with its stuffy, hesitant-to-change culture, was ripe for a challenge, and they knew it as well as anyone. The counter to the Live announcement came from the tour's wary commissioner, Jay Monahan, who sent each tour member a memo explaining they were sweetening the pot. For the upcoming season, there'd be more prize money at tournaments, more money devoted to the Player Impact Program that compensates for their roles in boosting the tour's engagement, and that there'd be an entirely new bonus fund for players appearing in 15 or more PGA events. If the carrot wasn't enough, there was also the stick. Along with more money, Monahan also warned that if players defected to whatever this new league was, they'd be banned from playing in the PGA Tour. For one of golf's biggest names and one of the PGA's highest earners, the carrot wasn't enough, and the stick was just another example of an organization with too much power. Following Monahan's counter, Phil Mickelson, the longtime fan favorite, the lovable lefty who just so happened to be playing in the Saudi International Tournament, took the time in an interview about his future to point out that the PGA Tour's greed had reached obnoxious proportions, that their hoarding of players' digital media rights worth millions, among other things, was pushing players to look for new places to play. While he didn't say that he had found a new place to play, the writing was on the wall. Secession was in the air. Back in the States, the tour went on. But at each stop, the tension built, rumors circulated on who was making the jump, and ever so quietly, offers of guaranteed contracts in the tens of millions began making their way to top players. Then suddenly, as the golf world descended on the Riviera Golf Course in California's Pacific Palisades for the Genesis Open, a bombshell article rocked the sports world, nearly collapsing the Saudi coup before it even really took shape. With his new biography on Mickelson available for pre-order and the media buzz over the mysterious Saudi challenger building, Alan Shipnick thought the timing was right to pull back the curtain. Mickelson was, in fact, working with the startup Saudi League, having already recruited 3 other top players to make the flip. But of bigger consequence, Mickelson was aware of the bigger picture, too. He called the league nothing more than sports washing, he called the Saudis scary, and he made no qualms about the fact that the move was about nothing more than money and leverage. In the story's wake, golfers now had to make their intentions clear to fans and media. Were they so focused on the money, they'd overlook Saudi Arabian atrocities like the money-obsessed Mickelson. Some stayed coy, alluding to or outright mentioning that they'd sign NDAs, effectively signaling that they were likely deep in negotiations with Liv or had already come to an agreement. But most, especially golf's biggest names who were rumored targets of Liv, went out of their way to align themselves with the PGA Tour and to disparage the Saudi-backed challenger. Before anyone really knew what it would be, the Saudi project seemed dead. Mickelson stepped away from golf for the moment, and the world moved on. Then, Greg Norman announced the Live Golf Invitational. 8 tournaments, 5 of which not halfway across the world, but in the US, an eye-watering $255 million in prize money for a field of only 48 players, and a format that had golfers only playing 3 rounds rather than 4. Essentially, it was a tour with convenient locations, lower stress, less competition, and prize money that, on a tournament-by-tournament basis, would usually more than double what the PGA Tour offered. It was a tour whose leader was one of golf's most famous figureheads. It was a tour that conveniently distanced itself from its Saudi Arabian roots in locations and branding, and it was a tour that injected more money into the sport than anyone could have imagined. For its part, the PGA Tour thought it was in the clear. They had already dangled the carrot, outlined potential punishment, and after benefiting from Mickelson putting his foot in his mouth, they simply couldn't be bothered. They had moved on. Players, though, began to reconsider. One by one, they decided that perhaps it wasn't too toxic of a public relations move to join the tour, or that the money was at least more valuable than the image hit. Dustin Johnson was the first big name to turn on his early promise to back the PGA, signing for $125 million to flip allegiances and resigning his PGA membership. Then, at the very first LIV tournament, the benefits of defecting became all the more obvious as Charles Schwartzel, a lower-profile PGA Tour player who hadn't finished first in a tour event in 6 years, ended up winning a cool $4.75 million. Not long after, DeChambeau too countered his previous statements and joined the Saudi-backed tour. Then came Brooks Koepka and Cam Smith, 2 of golf's brightest stars. Golf's civil war, the one the PGA Tour thought it had already won, was back on, with the Saudi side flipping the battlefield with nothing more than a massive influx of cash. LIV, however, is far from Saudi Arabia's first foray into professional sports. This is World Wrestling Entertainment's 2022 schedule of pay-per-view events. While WWE packs a non-stop calendar of TV shows and non-televised events, these specials are the ones you hear about, the biggest moneymakers for the entertainment company. They feature the biggest stars: Roman Reigns, Hulk Hogan, Brock Lesnar, John Cena, The Undertaker, and the biggest plot points in the series' ongoing scripted narrative. Correspondingly, they are rare. 2022 saw 17 across the year, just 3 of which occurring outside the US. September's Clash at the Castle in Wales, while the 2 other international events were held in Jeddah and Riyadh. Searching through the company's quarterly reports, it's no wonder why. Every few quarters, the media revenue attributed to the other category shoots up by about $50 million. Dating back to 2018, the quarters when this happens corresponds exactly to when the company hosts an event in Saudi Arabia. It even drops out when events were canceled due to COVID. This has led to an understanding that Saudi Arabia is paying the company about $50 million per event. Scanning down and to the right puts that into perspective. With a mere 2 per year, summing to a massive $100 million, these Saudi events are responsible for close to 10% of the annual revenue of the world's 37th most valuable entertainment company. And they've been popular. After all, the scripted nature of WWE allows the company to guarantee it. At the 2022 event in Wales, Clash at the Castle, many speculated that reigning champion Roman Reigns would be set to lose to Scottish contender Drew McIntyre because the Scottish underdog winning against the American champion is exactly what the European fans would want to see, and traditionally, the entertainment company scripts their storylines to entertain their fans. But in this case, the customer was Saudi Arabia, and in order to guarantee the reigning champion would fight up-and-coming star Logan Paul in Riyadh that November, a fight that was sure to generate massive attention, Roman Reigns had to win in Wales. But the drama outside the arena was far more real. 3 years prior, the 2019 edition of the same Crown Jewel event failed to air live as scheduled in its host country. There is still no official explanation for this, but there are plenty of rumors. They go that the Saudi government was late on a $60 million payment for the prior event. That part is corroborated in financial reports, and either to force their hand or in retribution, WWE briefly cut off the feed to the Saudi local broadcaster. Ultimately, the event did make it to broadcast in its host country with a 1-hour tape delay, but then WWE faced its own issues. As 200 performers and personnel gathered for their 3 a.m. charter flight to Buffalo, New York, where the company's flagship Monday Night Raw show is being filmed, flight crew started to announce delay after delay after delay with no real explanation for why. One anonymous wrestler later testified in a lawsuit against WWE, stating that the doors of the plane were blocked by armed guards in black militia attire, and that a crew member stated, "It seems someone doesn't want us to leave the country." The wrestler also said the company's senior director of talent relations told him that the payments dispute had truly occurred, that the feed was cut, and that the Saudi crown prince was, quote, very mad. This interpretation of the events led many to describe it as a hostage incident, that Saudi Arabia failed to allow the plane to take off to get back at WWE. Now, this testimony is only one small part of a larger suit alleging that WWE misrepresented broadcast rights negotiations with the Saudi government to its investors, but despite their best efforts, WWE could not get this lawsuit dismissed and settled for $39 million. Not an admission of guilt, but at least an indication that it was too difficult to disprove the claims. Of course, WWE has vehemently denied rumors of this so-called hostage incident, claiming that it was just mechanical issues. Wrestlers, meanwhile, have been tight-lipped and vague when talking about it, potentially wary to threaten their highly lucrative contracts with the company. But in this case, the facts hardly matter to Saudi Arabia because the public believes it. The country turned the spotlight on itself, and in return, a story emerged that only shaped the uninformed's understanding of how the country and its ruling royals operates. And it's hardly the only time this has happened. In 2022, the second ever Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, a stop on Formula One's globe-spanning calendar, was overshadowed by a massive plume of smoke in the background. This was visible during the Friday's practice sessions, but as on-track action finished up for the night, reports emerged that this wasn't a simple fire, it was an attack. More specifically, it was an attack by Houthi rebels who fight one side of the ongoing civil war in neighboring Yemen. Now, this conflict is widely understood as a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Iran is supporting the Houthi rebels, Saudi Arabia, the former central government, worried that a Houthi-led Yemen would function as a satellite state of Iran, an untenable proposition given their massive land border. Therefore, the Houthis regularly undertake attacks on Saudi Arabia, as they did in this case on an oil depot on the outskirts of Jeddah. Immediately, a drivers' union meeting was called to discuss whether they'd force the cancellation of the race, and reportedly, the initial consensus was yes. In the minutes and hours that followed, a rotating cast of team principals, Formula One executives, Saudi Arabian officials, and others came through the room, convincing drivers of the strength of air defense systems around the track and supposedly discussing the, quote, consequences of the race not going ahead as planned. Meanwhile, discussion erupted on social media as pictures emerged from the endless drivers' meeting, and much of it was over why the race would be threatened by a drone attack in the first place. In the end, after 4.5 hours stretching into the early morning, drivers relented and the race went ahead as planned. But once again, the spotlight shone on Saudi Arabia, and the picture wasn't pretty. The kingdom has been widely condemned for its role in what the UN describes as the world's worst humanitarian crisis in Yemen. They've imposed an air and sea blockade on the country that has contributed to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians due to famine. According to Human Rights Watch, there is also a pattern of Saudi-led strikes on civilian areas or on military targets in densely populated areas where civilian casualties are inevitable, both of which are a violation of the laws of war. The Saudi coalition has also engaged in so-called double tapping, where one airstrike is conducted, then another is later done in the same spot on those that come to aid the injured. But Saudi Arabia's repressiveness is not best defined by its war crimes. After all, tragically, they are hardly the only nation conducting such attacks. There is wide understanding that a number of developed Middle Eastern nations are repressive by Western standards. Nations like Qatar and the UAE are known for the dissonance between their flashy, westernized cityscapes and their limited human rights. Both engage in widespread modern slavery, both severely limit women's rights, both heavily restrict freedom of speech and the press, both have zero LGBT rights and police forces that regularly abuse and torture queer people. The list goes on and on. But even compared to this, Saudi Arabia is in a league of its own. Whereas Qatar and the UAE have laws on the books criminalizing homosexuality but rarely enforce them, Saudi Arabia does, regularly punishing with prison sentences, lashes, and even execution. Whereas Qatar restricts access by women to certain venues and the UAE forbids women from initiating divorce without court order, Saudi Arabia still operates under a strict guardianship system where women must obtain approval from a male guardian for certain rights. For example, women of all ages need their guardian's approval to marry, and once married, women are legally required to remain, quote, obedient to their husband, even to the extent of not refusing sex without a, quote, legitimate excuse. But the nation's brutality can't even be fully described in such a comparative manner because a key tenet of it is the fact that Saudi Arabia barely has codified laws. Judges sentence based on ambiguous and changing interpretations of Sharia law, which is based on the Quran, but that means people are regularly sentenced even to death for ambiguous, unprovable crimes, leading to wide-scaled, institutionalized jailing and killing of those who dare challenge the ruling royal family's reign in any way. According to Freedom House's annual Freedom in the World survey, the nation is, by a sizable margin, the least free nation in the world to be so wealthy. That puts the nation in a unique situation from a branding perspective. All of these nations, the other wealthiest in the world, get wealthy world things like golf and WWE and Formula One. And while far from perfect, these other nations are on balance far less repressive than Saudi Arabia. Therefore, when people's primary exposure to the nation is through wealthy world entertainment franchises, it's only natural to assume that Saudi Arabia is similar to the UAE or United Kingdom or UK. But Phil Mickelson, at least, recognized just how problematic the Saudi regime was when he noted their role in human rights abuse and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And the PGA Tour proved well aware too, as time and time again, they've brought up Saudi Arabia's role in 9/11 during their public battle against LIV for hearts, minds, and golfers. But money simply proved too much for Mickelson in 2021, and in the summer of 2023, the PGA Tour found itself in the same position as the golfer. On June 6th, the PGA Tour announced something that not a single one of its players saw coming. It was merging with LIV. The two leagues would quit poaching one another's players, they'd drop the lawsuits and counter lawsuits, and the Saudi Public Investment Fund would be the exclusive investor in the merged tour. It was a complete shock. It was bigger than golf, bigger than sports. Following the announcement, Commissioner Monahan, who had railed against the atrocities committed by Saudi Arabia, offered a statement trying to justify the deal, while 9/11 families, golfers who had turned down tens of millions on principles that Monahan had outlined, and the wider world quickly called him and the tour hypocrites. Monahan was a hypocrite, but ultimately, from a business perspective, he was likely right to concede. In the coming days, it became clear that Monahan had understood this for a while, telling tour employees that they couldn't compete with a foreign government with unlimited money in a private meeting, and started the process of negotiating some months earlier. The merger was at once indefensible and inevitable, because neither money nor profitability were the reason for Saudi Arabia's entrance into professional golf. LIV, with hardly a TV deal or any real path to profitability, would simply outlast the PGA Tour. With an estimated $50 million spent in legal fees and $100 million spent on bigger purses and player bonuses, PGA Tour reserves had begun to run dry by early 2022, and the only recourse was to give the Sovereign Wealth Fund what it really wanted: a seat at the table. With every additional overlap between professional sports and Saudi Arabia, global media speculates on what the nation's intentions truly are. It's not money, at least not now, as they're spending far more than could ever return to develop their profile of professional sports. It's also not the short-term image effects, as often suggested, since for as much as Formula One or WWE or LIV imply a level of legitimacy for the nation, they also highlight its repressiveness and regressiveness. It's only natural. The nation is repressive and regressive, so when you bring international cameras and journalists an attention that can't be stymied by intimidation, arrest, and imprisonment as domestic equivalents can, inevitably the world is going to hear about the nation's issues. And when the global consensus is that legitimizing Saudi Arabia through sports is a bad idea, stories or even rumors proving that point are only going to be amplified further. But it's ultimately quite tough to evaluate decision-making in an absolute monarchy. At the end of the day, maybe Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman just really likes sports. Or maybe he just wants fun events for him and his wealthy friends. Or maybe there's not much strategy at all behind this foray into professional sports, since even the billions being spent on it are a paltry sum compared to the scale of royal family wealth in Saudi Arabia. Perhaps the most cohesive explanation, though, is that this isn't some short-term branding exercise. The kingdom isn't expecting the world to think positively about it just because they put on some decent golf. Rather, this seems one small part of the nation's massive reorientation. Saudi Arabia is trying very, very hard to set itself up for a post-oil era. In doing so, it's trying very, very hard to become a place like Dubai, a diversified, modern, service-based Middle Eastern economy as integrated with the world as Singapore or Sao Paulo. It's trying to end its era of isolation and become a player in international affairs as the era of insularity funded by oil exports draws closer to a close. This is a practical necessity for the ruling family since the tolerance of their grip on power has been undergirded by the prosperity brought to the nation during their reign. If this prosperity fails to maintain into a post-oil era, so too might the monarchy itself. As part of this, genuine reform is happening. Many of the nation's most repressive policies are no longer, but mostly the most visible ones. The indiscriminate arrest, jailing, torture, and execution of dissidents and activists still occur. The absence of democracy is still unchanged. Sports are dominating the conversation about Saudi Arabia, but they're also creating conversation. They're not necessarily supposed to be immediately and directly effective at rebranding the nation. Rather, they're part of the long game. WWE or Formula One or professional golf just embed themselves with other parts of the wealthy world naturally. Saudi Arabia, as it makes its transition out of insularity, needs to force it. They're faking it until they make it. So the question asked every time they make an additional encroachment into sports is whether it's right to help Saudi Arabia fake it before they've made it, before they've genuinely turned themselves into a place that respects human rights. Sports executives constantly argue that the order of operations is right, that engagement with Western culture will propagate Western principles of human rights. But through this, these executives are making a massive gamble on whether they'll land on the right side of history. Because the other option is that their executive bonuses are being based on their culpability in branding the nation as a place that respects human rights without them actually doing so, because, after all, the best possible future for Saudi's rulers is that they get to continue their autocratic ways while being perceived and treated by the Western world as a normal place. The world has problems. In many cases because power is concentrated and held by a small number of individuals who happen to be the same people who are best able to profit from problems. But despite that, these same problems get solved by the actions of those who have devoted their lives to solving them. If you're worried about the threat of AI or pandemics or nuclear bombs or global wars or climate change, you truly can make an impact in solving these problems by doing what you're already doing, working. You'll work an average of 80,000 hours in your career, so our sponsor, 80,000 Hours, is a nonprofit dedicated to solving these problems by helping people like you change their careers in order to do good. And they're focused on making this actually feasible. They've done over 10 years of research and synthesized it into their career guides and other resources like their podcasts, job boards, and they even offer one-on-one careers calls with their impartial advising team. These elusive jobs that pay well, make an impact, and are fulfilling are out there. They're just a little harder to find. So that's what 80,000 Hours is here to help with. Their focus is to help you help others. So if you want to make your 80,000 hours of work fulfilling and impactful, start by joining their newsletter and you'll get a free copy of their in-depth career guide sent to your inbox. Just click the button on screen or head to 80,000hours.org/Wendover.